You know, capitalism can be an incredibly powerful tool for good. It can also be an incredibly powerful tool for evil. It can lift 500 million people in China out of desperate poverty into a middle class, or it can create unconscionable inequity. A few years ago, 300 people in the world had as much wealth as half the world's population. Today, that number is just 8 people. And so we can create a capitalism of shared prosperity, but it is not automatic. It is not a self-fulfilling prophecy. The idea of creating shared value says that not all profit is equal. There is profit that is rent-paying, that is extracting value from a society without giving back, as we see, as Africa has lived through with its natural resources. And there is a profit that goes back to the community. Not as philanthropy, but as wages, as taxes for government, as philanthropy as well, sure. But it creates a virtuous cycle where the economic wealth that is created benefits the community, which raises the level of education, which raises the local resources, which creates even more wealth in the future. And what shared value is about is creating that virtuous cycle. Africa has leapfrogged the world in technology. I would like to see Africa leapfrog the world in the right way to do capitalism. So we've spent the day talking about creating shared value, and it has been an extraordinary day. And I was in Australia a few weeks ago for a shared value event there, in New York for one there. There are events coming up in Colombia, in Chile, in Costa Rica. The idea of creating shared value has become a national and global movement that Professor Porter and I certainly never foresaw when we wrote that article 6 or 7 years ago. But for all the momentum this idea has had, there are a lot of different definitions of what shared value really means. And I can't let you sit through a whole day talking about shared value without taking a few minutes to try and be very clear about at least what Michael Porter and I meant when we wrote this article on creating shared value. Because as has been said several times, it's not corporate social investment, it's not philanthropy, it's not about the reputation of a company. Shared value is a competitive strategy. It is a way for companies to grow, to become more profitable, and to find a stronger competitive position. So let me just step back for a moment and channel Michael Porter and talk for a second about what competitive strategy is. You know, there are a lot of companies that go around saying, we want to be the best. Porter would say, there is no best. There is no best automobile. Sure, they're luxury automobiles, but most people can't afford them. And for some people, the best car is an inexpensive one. And for some people, the best car is a truck. And for some people, the best car is an electric hybrid. The way to compete is to find a particular need for a particular customer segment and tailor a product to meet that need better than anyone else in the world. And so true competitive strategy is about finding a unique competitive position that is different from others in your industry. Because if you do the same thing that other companies in your industry do, you're going to have the same result. and you're going to end up competing only on narrowing your profit margin, not on creating a sustainable, growing enterprise. So how does this relate to the idea of creating shared value that we've talked about today? Well, shared value says there is a whole dimension of the world that companies have ignored. There are markets that they have never thought about entering because they designed their products or services for the very thin layer of the affluent population in the developed world. There are products that they never thought about. There are ways of doing business, of working with your employees and your supply chain to have a more efficient and productive and powerful company that companies have ignored because we were taught by classical economics that social and environmental issues are externalities. They're not something to pay attention to when we develop our business strategy or when we think about the cost-benefit of a decision we might make as an investment. But the reality is, social and environmental issues are business opportunities. And when companies approach them as a business opportunity, they bring resources and skills and commitment that we do not see when they approach it as corporate social investment. So the idea of creating shared value says we can and must build social and environmental issues into the strategies of our company. You heard Pirana say earlier that the SDGs represent a $12 trillion set of business opportunities. And the only way we will realize those goals is by engaging the private sector, not only as philanthropists, but as business people trying to build businesses that can scale and be sustained and solve these problems. So when Michael and I wrote about creating shared value, we said shared value happens at 3 levels. The first level is new products and markets. And let me just give you a quick example of that. In Africa today, less than 5% of the population has insurance. And the insurance products do not fit much of the population of Africa. So a company called MicroInsure wanted to grapple with this problem. And insurance is a hard concept to explain to someone who's never dealt with it before, to someone who doesn't necessarily trust businesses. And the risk of insurance means that you have to have a very large population that you can spread that risk over, because otherwise people will self-select and you'll get only the sick people or the ill people who pay for the insurance and it won't work. So how do you start something like that? Well, MicroInsure said, you know, everybody's got a cell phone. What if we tied life insurance to cell phone minutes? What if we said, with Airtel and Tigo, you get free basic life insurance just for staying with your plan. And if you want to add a family member, it'll cost you $1 a year. And if you want to add health insurance, it'll cost you $1 a month. Well, there are now 60 million people in Africa with insurance through MicroInsure. It's all handled through the cell phone. The claims that they pay are modest, but they're enough to make a tremendous difference to someone who has lost a family member in these rural villages and settings. It's a product that we never thought of before, and it is creating great shared value. The second level we talk about is to think about productivity in your value chain and your supply chain in a different way. You know, companies never used to worry about where their supplies came from. They just put out tenders and bought the least expensive. But we heard this wonderful story from Sam about Nando's and from Faraz about Woolies. And who can doubt that they have a stronger supply chain, more productive suppliers, better quality products, a competitive advantage because they are going into their supply chain and working with individual farmers to help them become more successful. Or to take another example, Olam in Mozambique works with 65,000 cotton farmers to provide financing, to provide credit for better agricultural inputs, to guarantee purchases, and has raised their incomes an average of 33%. This is about rethinking the productivity in your value chain and supply chain and taking responsibility for solving the social problems that government has not stepped up to solve. The third level of creating shared value we talk about as strengthening the economic cluster or community where a company operates. And one quick example there, Cisco Systems, the networking company, discovered about a decade ago that one of the biggest constraints on their growth is there weren't enough trained network administrators in the world, not for them to hire, but for their customers to be able to maintain the equipment Cisco wanted to sell them. And they said, you know what? We can train network administrators better than anybody else. We can do it through a distance learning curriculum, but there also needs to be a local partner, whether it's an NGO or a university or a high school, that it provides a place people can actually physically work on the equipment. And they created thousands of networking academies around the world. They have trained in the last 10 years 4 million people to become network administrators, 70% of whom have gotten new jobs or better jobs because of the credential that they got. Right here in Johannesburg, they've trained 80,000 people. And they've made a commitment to train another 100,000 in South Africa by 2020. It is creating new livelihoods and opportunities for people who would otherwise not have it, and it is improving the business environment for them to be able to sell more product. So when we talk about creating shared value, it is a business strategy, but that does not in any way diminish its power in solving the problems we face as a society. Let me offer 3 quick cautions, though. The first is that shared value does not solve all problems. There is still absolutely a need for corporate social investment, for philanthropy, for the role of government that is irreplaceable, as Jay so eloquently described. And, you know, I felt so sorry for Brian from Anglo Gold Ashanti when he was up here confronting the layoffs of 2,000 people. That's the reality of business. There will be times where what works for the business does not work for society. And there are ways companies can mitigate the impact of that, and they should. But not everything businesses do can create shared value. So that's one important caution. It doesn't solve all problems. Secondly, as James said from Dahlberg, we need to be tri-sector athletes. Shared value requires partnerships between companies and with NGOs and with government. These large problems, reforming agriculture, reforming land rights, can't be tackled by a single company. But companies can provide leadership, and they can provide imagination, creativity, and innovation to find solutions and to bring the other players together to embrace a common agenda and work together toward those solutions, toward solving the challenges of the SDGs. I also want to emphasize that shared value is not in conflict with the idea that we're trying to earn a profit for our shareholders. You know, when John from Old Mutual was up here and we had that very interesting conversation about whether they should take a lower return on their investments to invest in socially responsible companies, well, that's not how we think about it in terms of shared value. Because if it's truly shared value, it adds to the return. It adds to the profitability and success of the company. But again, the power in doing that is the scale and innovation and resources that you can tap. We're used to thinking about government as the big player. But to take the statistics from the US, the nonprofit sector in the US is quite large. It's $1 trillion. Government in the US has a budget annually of $3 trillion. The revenues of the private sector in the US are $23 trillion. So if we really want to mobilize the resources necessary to achieve these ambitious goals, we need the private sector in there, and we need the kind of commitment and dedication and innovation that we will only get if it is aligned with the incentives of the company. I have to congratulate Tiki Barnard and her team and the sponsors for such an extraordinary day here today. And I know there's going to be a formal launch of the Africa Shared Value Initiative tomorrow. And I just want to conclude with a word about why I think that's so important. And I want to use an example. It's from the US. It's a somewhat different example. But Atul Gawande, a physician and writer and brilliant man in the US, did a study around healthcare costs. And in the US, healthcare costs are very much out of control. And he found a small city in Texas that had the highest healthcare costs per person in the country. And he found another city in Texas, less than 200 miles away, that had the lowest healthcare costs per person in the country. The demographics were the same. The health outcomes were the same. And he went to these cities to try and understand, why is there such a difference? And what he discovered is the difference was in the culture within the healthcare community. In one community, a few leading influential doctors had adopted an approach to maximize their earnings and to give people every possible test to protect themselves as much as possible from any risk of medical malpractice. And it sent medical costs skyrocketing. And in the other community, for whatever reason, a different culture had evolved. A culture that focused on minimizing unnecessary expenditures and focusing on the health of the people. Culture is tremendously important. And if Africa is going to leapfrog to the good capitalism, it's going to depend on the culture that is created in the business community here. It's going to depend on the vision and the leadership of you in this room to spread this culture so that when business thinks about how to succeed, they think about the kind of profit that enables everyone to succeed. And when they make choices and they make decisions, a culture has evolved that keeps people focused on the welfare of the entire society. And that only happens in a local context, in a local country and community, with local business leaders. And that's why creating a shared value initiative in Africa is so important, I believe, because it's through days like today and the conversations among business leaders that the culture of shared value can be created. And if we can do that, Africa will have an extraordinarily bright future. Thank you very much.